So in this video, we're going to be looking at rounding numbers, with a focus on rounding numbers to a specific number of decimal places. Now, in the previous video, we ended up by looking at these two questions, where the answer had to be given to 2 decimal places and 1 decimal place. And although I briefly went through how to do that, we're going to be looking at this in more detail in this video. So we're going to begin by looking at money as a way of helping us to understand this. So let's look at a couple of questions. What is £1.49 to the nearest pound? And what is £1.51 to the nearest pound? So for the first question, the answer would be £1. And for the second question, the answer would be £2. Well, why is this? Well, let's look at a number line and let's put these values on that number line. So there's £1, there's £2, and the midway point is £1.50. But if I was to put £1.49 and £1.51 on this number line, they would go here and here. This isn't to scale. We can see that £1.49 is closer to £1 than it is to £2. So we would round £1.49 down to £1. And £1.51 is closer to £2. So we would round £1.51 up to £2. And I might as well mention it now. With £1.50, if we were rounding this, normally we would round £1.50, although it's the midway point, it can go either way, but normally we would round £1.50 up to £2, unless specified otherwise. Well, now let's take away the pound signs. So this time we have 1 and 2. And we have the halfway point 1.5, and we have the numbers 1.49 and 1.51. I'm going to zoom in on the number line around 1.5 to include 1.49 and 1.51. I'm going to write a series of numbers that get closer and closer to 1.5, and we're going to round those numbers to the nearest 1. I'll begin by looking at this part here. So we know that 1.49 rounds down to 1. If we type 1.499, this also rounds down to 1. 1.4999 also rounds down to 1, and 1.49999 rounds down to 1. The point being, it doesn't matter how many 9s I'm adding onto the end of this decimal. The value is always going to be less than 1.5. And so will always be closer to 1 than it is to 2. And the digit that is determining this is the 4/10 here. Because of the way the decimal system works, we know that because it's 1.4 something, 1.4 is always going to be less than 1.5. And so we can have 1.499999 and 9 can continue forever and ever and ever. It will still always be less than 1.5. And so the tenths column is determining whether we round down or round up. And in this case, because it's 4, it means it's less than halfway, so we round down. Now let's do something similar with 1.51. I'm going to concern myself with this space here, and we're going to get closer and closer and closer to 1.5. So we know that 1.51 rounds up to 2. But if I had 1.501, this would also round up to 2. And if we had 1.5001, this would round up to 2. And if we had 1.50001, this would also round up to 2. And although these numbers are getting closer and closer and closer to 1.5, all these numbers are still greater than 1.5. Again, the determining digit in these numbers is the 5/10. This tells us that we are either halfway between 1 and 2 or greater than halfway between 1 and 2. And remember, 1.5 is the halfway point. And with 1.5, if it was just 1.5, we would round that up to 2, unless otherwise specified. Let's look at this example again. But this time I'm moving the digits of the specific numbers one place to the right. So 1 now becomes 0.1, 2 becomes 0.2, the halfway point changes from 1.5 to 0.15, and the two numbers that we are rounding are, instead of 1.49, they become 0.149, and instead of 1.51, we now have 0.151. Again, I'm going to zoom in on the number line. Looking at this space here, we can rewrite these numbers as 0.149, 0.1499, 0.14999, and 0.149999. And all of these numbers round down to 0.1. And we can add as many 9s as we like. These values will always be less than 0.15, and so will always have to be rounded down. The determining digit in this case is the 400ths. We've got 0.14 something, and this will always be less than 0.15. And it doesn't, like I say, it doesn't matter how many 9s we add on, 0.14 something is always going to be less than 0.15. Similarly, if we look at 0.151 and look at values between 0.15 and 0.151, all these values will round up to 0.2, and the determining digit in each of these numbers is the 500ths. And the fact that we have 0.15 something, this tells us that all these values are greater than 0.15, and so we round up to 0.2. Now, what we've done in this specific example with all these numbers is that we have rounded all these numbers to one decimal place. That is, if we look at 0.149, we have rounded this number to 0.1. And we say it's been rounded to one decimal place. That means it's been rounded to one digit after the decimal point. So you might have got a question looking something like this. Round 0.149 to one decimal place. Now, how you then approach this, and we were covering this in the previous video, well, let's write down 0.149. We're rounding to one decimal place, that is, one digit after the decimal point. So this becomes our cutoff point. And what we then have to do is we look at this one, the 1/10, and say, well, does this stay as 1? i.e., do we round down? Or do we round up to 2? And that's done by looking at this digit, the first digit after the cutoff point. Doesn't matter about anything else. All that matters is the first digit after the cutoff point. And we look at this, and if it's 4 or less, we round down. And if it's 5 or more, we round up. Now, because this digit is 4, it means that the 1/10 stays as 1/10. And so we would write this as 0.149 is equal to 0.1 to one decimal place. And if we were looking at this on a number line, Well, there's a 0.1, there's a 0.2, there's the halfway point, which is 0.15, and this is where 0.149 would be on the number line, and therefore we round down. And of course you know this because we were looking at this just a minute ago. And it's really important to understand in this case what the question is asking. Are we rounding this number to 0.1, or do we round this number to 0.2? Because we are rounding to one decimal place. So that's why we've got 0.1 and 0.2 on our number line. And then here's our halfway point, which is 0.15. Similarly, if we were asked, well, what is 0.151 to one decimal place? Well, if we write down 0.151, well, there's the cutoff point. So we look at the 1/10 and say, right, well, do we round down? That is, does this 1/10 stay as 1/10? Or do we round this 1/10 up to 2/10? And this is determined by this digit here, the first digit after the cutoff point. It doesn't matter about any of the other digits. If this value is 4 or less, we round down. If the value is 5 or more, we round up. We can see that this digit, which is 500ths, is 5 or more. We therefore round the 1/10 up to 2/10. And again, if we were looking at this on a number line, this is where the 0.151 is. Of course, it's closer to 0.2 than it is to 0.1. And that is what we are doing when we are rounding a number to a specific number of decimal places. Let's look at some other examples of rounding numbers to one decimal place. So, round 43.74 to one decimal place. So what the question is asking is, do we round this number down to 43.7 or do we round it up to 43.8? So there's the cutoff point, and we're going to round this number to the nearest tenth. So we have 43.7, and we have to determine whether we keep the 7/10 the same or whether we round this up to 8/10. And we do this by looking at the first digit after the cutoff point. And we can see that this digit is 4. And because this number is 4, we're going to keep the 7 the same. So 43.74 is equal to 43.7 to one decimal place. And this is how we write it. We have a bracket with 1 dp in it, and this will tell us that this number has been rounded to one decimal place. So here's our number line, and we are concerned with whether we round the number down to 43.7 or round it up to 43.8. The halfway point between 43.7 and 43.8 is 43.75. Now this isn't to scale, but if I was to put 43.74 onto this number line, it would go somewhere round about here. And this, of course, is closer to 43.7 than it is to 43.8. So when we are rounding this number to one decimal place, that is what's going on the number line. And that's why we end up with 43.7. Let's look at another example. Round 9.85 to one decimal place. So what this question is asking is, do we round this number down to 9.8 or do we round it up to 9.9? So there's our cutoff point, and we need to determine whether we keep this 8 the same or whether we round it up. And if we look at the first digit after the cutoff point, we can see that this is 5, and therefore, because it's 5 or more, we round the 8 up to 9. So 9.85 is equal to 9.9 to one decimal place. Again, we put 1 dp in brackets to say that this number has been rounded to 1 decimal place. Let's look at this on a number line. Because we are rounding to the nearest tenth, we have 9.8 and 9.9 on a number line, and we have the midway point, which is 9.85. Now, because the number that we are rounding to 1 decimal place is actually the midpoint, we therefore round this number up. Round 702.2801 to 1 decimal place. So this question is asking, do we round this number down to 702.2, or do we round this number up to 702.3? So here's our cutoff point, and we now have to say, right, does this 2 remain as 2, or do we round this 2 up to 3? We look at the first digit after the cutoff point, which is equal to 8. We're not concerned with any of the other digits. Now, because this digit is 8, we will round the 2 up to 3. So 702.2801 rounds to 702.3 to 1 decimal place. And again, here it is on a number line. When rounding to 1 decimal place, we are concerned with whether this number rounds to 702.2 or 702.3. And the halfway point is 702.25. And if we were to mark our number on that number line, again, this isn't to scale, but it's going to be somewhere here. And so we can see that 702.2801 is closer to 702.3 than it is to 702.2. This is what we are doing when we are rounding. So going back to one of the questions in the previous video, where we had to write 1.3 kilometers as a percentage of 704 meters. And remember, we converted the kilometers into meters. This is something that we'll be looking at in a later video. But when we typed in 1,300 divided by 740 multiplied by 100, we ended up with 175.6756 and so on. And we were asked to give the answer to 1 decimal place, and we ended up with the answer 175.7 to 1 decimal place. And if we look at this in more detail, so here's 175.6756 ... Here's our cutoff point. So the question is does the 6 stay the same, or do we round that 6 up? So we look at the first digit after the cutoff point, which is 7. This is 7 hundredths. And because this is 7 or more, we are going to round the 6 up to 7. And that's why we end up with 175.7 to 1 decimal place. And here's how this would look on a number line. Our limits are 175.6 and 175.7. Our midway point is 175.65. And this is where our answer fits on that number line. And this approach can be used for rounding to 2 decimal places, say. So when we are talking about rounding a number to 2 decimal places, we are now talking about rounding to 2 decimal places after the decimal point. So if we are asked to round 0.14506 to 2 decimal places, well, here's the number, and here's our cutoff point. In this case, for rounding to 2 decimal places, this question is asking, do we round this number down to 0.14, or do we round this number up to 0.15? We now have to determine whether we round the 4, which is 4 hundredths, whether this stays the same, or whether we round this up to 5. And we do this by looking at the first digit after the cutoff point. In this case, that digit is 5, it's 5 thousandths. And because this digit is 5 or more, we round the 4 up to 5. Let's look at this on a number line, just to get you thinking about what's going on here. We are concerned about whether we round 0.14506, whether we round that down to 0.14 or round it up to 0.15. Remember, we are rounding to 2 decimal places. The midway point is 0.145. And the number that we're starting with is somewhere here. Again, it's not to scale. And we can see that this number is closer to 0.15 than it is to 0.14. So the process is still the same, it's just that the cutoff point is different. And if we go back to the question from the previous video, where we had what is 230 litres as a percentage of 310 litres, when we did the calculation in the calculator, we had 230 divided by 310 multiplied by 100. And this is equal to 74.1935 and so on. And this rounded to 74.19% to 2 decimal places. Well, let's just confirm that. Here's our number. Here's the cutoff point. And we now need to determine whether we keep this 9 the same, this is 9 hundredths, or whether we round this 9 up. And we do this by looking at this digit here, the first digit after the cutoff point, which happens to be 3. And because this number is 4 or less, we keep this 9 the same. Now, before we look at this on a number line, let's just quickly look at this again. Let's just say it wasn't 74.1935 and so on. Let's just say this 3 was actually 6. So let's just say we had 74.1965 and so on. And we had to round this to 2 decimal places. If we look now at the first digit after the cutoff point to help us determine whether we keep the 9 the same or we round it up, this digit is now 6. So we have to round the 9 up to 10. So this 9 ends up becoming a 0, and the 1/10 actually becomes 2/10. So 74.1965 rounds up to 74.20 to 2 decimal places. And it's important to put the 0 in, as the answer is asking for 2 decimal places. And in our answer, there are no hundredths. That might appear a little bit complicated, but if you look at the first 2 digits after the decimal place, we've ended up rounding from 74.19 to 74.20. Crudely, looking at those 2 digits, we've rounded 19 up to 20. Let's look at this on a number line. Are we rounding this number down to 74.19? Remember, we are dealing with 2 decimal places. So do we round this number down to 74.19, or do we round this number up to 74.20? And the midway point is 74.195. And this is where 74.1965, etc. would fit on that number line. We can see that it is closer to 74.20 than it is to 74.19. And here's 74.1935 on the number line, and we can see that it is closer to 74.19 than it is to 74.20. Again, understanding how the number line works when doing this rounding might take a little while to get used to, but this is key to mathematically understanding what we are doing when we are rounding to 1 or 2 or even 3 decimal places. Let's do a similar question. Round 1.7981 to 2 decimal places. There's our number, and there's our cut-off point. So bearing in mind what we have just done in the previous example, the question is asking, when rounding this number to 2 decimal places, do we round this number down to 1.79, or do we round this number up to 1.80? We now have to determine whether we keep that 9 the same or whether we round up. We look at the first digit after the cut-off point, which this time happens to be 8. Because this digit is 5 or more, we round the 9 up. So we round the 9 up to 10. So the 9 becomes a 0, and the 7/10 actually becomes 8/10. So 1.7981 rounds to 1.80 to 2 decimal places, and it's important again to put the 0 in because we are writing this to 2 decimal places. And if we were looking at this on a number line, here are those numbers on a number line. The midway point is 1.795, and 1.7981 is somewhere along here, and that therefore means it's closer to 1.80 than it is to 1.79. This is the final question. Round 23.9805 to A, 1 decimal place, B, 2 decimal places, and C, 3 decimal places. Let's do part A. Well, here's the cut-off point, and we have to determine whether we keep this 9 the same or we round up. Well, we can look at the first digit after the cut-off point, which is 8. So that means we're having to round the 9 up to 10. And so the 9/10 becomes 0. And this 3, which is 3 units, becomes 4. So 23.9805 is equal to 24.0 to 1 decimal place. Now let's do 23.9805 to 2 decimal places. Here's the cut-off point. Do we keep this 8 the same or do we round it up? And if we look at the first digit after the cut-off point, this is 0. So 0 is 4 or less, so we keep this 8 the same. So the answer is 23.98 to 2 decimal places. And finally, let's round this number to 3 decimal places. The process is still the same. This time it's 3 places after the decimal point. We're now looking at the 0. Does this 0 remain 0, or do we round it up to 1? And if we look at the digit after the cut-off point, this digit is 5. So 0 rounds up to 1. So the answer is 23.981 to 3 decimal places. So that's all I'm going to be doing in this video on rounding to a specific number of decimal places. But I hope you found the video helpful. The process itself is, I think, quite straightforward. The challenge is actually understanding how this relates to a number line and why we end up with the answer that we do. And I think from a mathematical point of view, this is important. So when going back over the video, it would be advantageous to try and start getting your head around how these answers to 1, 2 or 3 decimal places relates to what's going on the number line. In the next video, we're going to be looking at significant figures, and that does draw on the work that we've covered in this video. Thank you for watching.